In the autumn of 1938, a wildlife biologist walked for 3 days through the hardwood forests of the Missouri Ozarks and did not see a single wild turkey, not a track, not a feather, not one call at dawn. He was standing in the middle of what used to be one of the richest turkey ranges on the continent, and the birds were simply gone. Across the entire United States, biologists estimated that fewer than 30,000 wild turkeys remained alive. In state after state, the bird had not been seen in decades. Vermont, 0. Ohio, 0. Massachusetts, 0. A creature that once greeted the first European settlers by the millions, a bird so central to American life that Benjamin Franklin argued it deserved to be the national symbol instead of the bald eagle, had been hunted and logged almost completely out of existence. And for 30 years afterward, the government tried to bring it back using a method that should have worked, and it failed almost every single time. This is that story. Every claim in this video is drawn from State Wildlife Agency restoration records and the published history of the National Wild Turkey Federation. This is not a folk tale about a Thanksgiving bird. This is one of the largest wildlife recovery operations in American history, and almost nobody outside of hunting and conservation circles knows the full version. But first, you need to understand exactly how this bird disappeared. When European settlers arrived, wild turkeys were everywhere. Colonial accounts describe flocks so large they blackened entire hillsides. Birds so unafraid of humans they could be killed with sticks. Some estimates place the original continental population between 7 and 10 million birds, spread through hardwood forests from Maine down through Florida and west into Texas. For nearly 3 centuries, that population was hunted with no restriction and no limit. Market hunters shot turkeys by the wagon load to sell in city meat markets. At the same time, the forests those birds depended on were being cleared for farmland, timber, and expanding cities. A wild turkey needs mature hardwood forest, acorns and beech nuts to survive winter, and tall trees to roost safely above predators. As the forests vanished, so did the birds inside them. By the early 1900s, the wild turkey had been wiped out in 18 of the 28 states where it once lived. By the 1930s, that population of 7 to 10 million had collapsed to roughly 30,000 survivors, clinging to the most remote forest patches left in the country. Wildlife agencies knew they had a crisis, and they responded the way most agencies of that era did. They tried to breed their way out of it. Starting in the 1930s, state after state built game farms, raised turkeys in pens like poultry, and released thousands of them into the wild, hoping they would repopulate the empty forests. It made sense on paper. It failed almost everywhere. Pen-raised turkeys were not wild turkeys in any meaningful sense. Fed by hand and never taught to fear predators, these birds walked into the forest and died in enormous numbers, with survival rates in some cases in the single digits. Many had even lost the instinct to fly up and roost at night, so they slept on the ground, where predators picked them off one by one. For nearly 30 years, agencies poured money into a strategy that simply was not working. Later in this video, you will see the almost accidental invention that finally broke that 30-year stalemate. But first, understand how close this bird came to being written off completely, with some biologists quietly concluding that full restoration might not even be possible. By the 1950s, a handful of researchers in the Missouri Ozarks tried something different. Instead of raising turkeys in captivity, what if biologists captured wild, already surviving turkeys from the last strongholds and physically relocated them into empty forest? The problem was catching one. Wild turkeys can run nearly 25 miles per hour and burst into flight at over 50 miles per hour. A chicken trap was useless. What Missouri biologists eventually refined was called the cannon net. A large net was folded flat near bait, rigged with small projectile charges along one edge. When a flock gathered to feed, the charges fired at once, launching the net through the air in under a second and covering the entire flock before a single bird could react. It worked. For the first time, biologists could capture genuinely wild, predator-savvy birds in real numbers and move them directly into the habitat waiting for them. The results were almost immediate. Wild trapped turkeys already knew how to find food, evade predators, and roost safely. Survival rates jumped dramatically, and these birds actually reproduced in the wild. A trapped flock of just a few dozen, released into good habitat, could grow into a self-sustaining population within a few years. States adopted the method through the 1960s and 70s, trapping surplus birds from recovering areas and shipping them into states where turkeys had been gone for generations. In 1973, hunters and conservationists formalized this effort into the National Wild Turkey Federation. At the time, the nationwide population stood at roughly 1.3 million birds, already a massive recovery from the 1930s, but still a fraction of the historic number. What happened next is where this story becomes remarkable. Trap and transfer operations continued state by state as abandoned farmland across the eastern United States slowly regrew into forest. States that had listed the wild turkey as completely gone within their borders reported stable, self-sustaining populations within a single generation. Today, wild turkeys exist in every one of the lower 48 states except one, and even in parts of southern Canada and Hawaii, where they were introduced. Current estimates place the population at somewhere between 6 and 7 million birds, a recovery of more than 200 times the 1930s low point. It happened almost entirely without public attention, using nothing more than a folded net and a handful of small explosive charges. But the second surprise is the part almost never mentioned alongside the celebration. As turkeys exploded back into regions they had been absent from for a century, they did not return to the exact forest their ancestors knew. Much of that original old-growth hardwood was gone forever, replaced by suburbs, farmland, and second-growth woodland. Turkeys proved remarkably adaptable to this new landscape, which created a new kind of friction. They began showing up in suburban backyards, on golf courses, and in cases that made local news, standing in the middle of residential streets refusing to move for cars. In some suburban areas, particularly in the Northeast, populations grew dense enough that agencies began fielding regular complaints about aggressive males during the spring breeding season, birds that treat mail carriers, joggers, and parked cars as rivals. A species biologist spent 30 years desperately trying to save had in some pockets of the country become abundant enough to be considered a nuisance. The third part of this story is what the recovery proved about wildlife restoration more broadly. For 30 years, agencies believed the answer to a vanishing species was manufacturing more of it in captivity. What the Missouri trapping program proved almost by accident was the opposite. The most effective way to restore a wild population was not to create new wild animals, but to move existing wild ones, already carrying the instincts their species had refined over thousands of years, into the empty space waiting for them. That single insight, wild to wild relocation instead of captive breeding, went on to shape how an entire generation of biologists approached bringing other vanished animals home. So here is the whole story in one breath. 30,000 birds left in the entire United States by the 1930s. 3 decades of a captive breeding strategy that failed almost everywhere. A folded net and a set of small explosive charges developed in the Ozark forests of Missouri that finally cracked the problem. A national federation founded in 1973 to carry that method across state lines. And a bird that now numbers between 6 and 7 million, common enough in parts of the country to stand in the middle of a suburban street and refuse to let a car pass. The wild turkey went from a bird most Americans in the 1930s assumed their grandchildren would only see in a history book to background scenery across half the country. But turkeys are not the only American icon that came within a hair of disappearing forever. In our next video, we look at a bird stamped on every dollar bill, And every government seal in the country, a bird that fell to fewer than 500 nesting pairs in the lower 48 states, brought to the edge not by hunting, but by a chemical quietly sprayed across American farmland for 20 years before anyone understood what it was doing. If you thought 30,000 turkeys was a low point, wait until you see how close the bald eagle came to vanishing from the country that made it a symbol. You will never look at that seal on the back of a dollar bill the same way again.